Welcome to Bug-Eyed Tales' collection of snake stories from all over the world about man versus serpent. Each one a struggle for survival, where the outcome hangs by the thinnest thread. Settle in and listen to the hiss of the serpents in Slithering Tales.
In our first story, a British explorer ventures too far into the wilds of the Niger River in 1908, only to find himself at the bottom of a hidden trap in The Horror in the Pit by E.F. Marin, late of the Royal Niger Company's service.
I've since been to a great extent cured, but in my earlier African days, somewhere about 11 years ago, I was full of romantic ideas and intoxicated with the strange glamour and mystery that pervaded everything, connected with the great Niger River and its unknown territories. Having tied up to a bank late one afternoon, half an hour before sunset, I took my gun, a sporting Martin, and set out from the little river launch, of which I was the sole white passenger, and made my way through the long grass skirting the banks of the stream until I emerged into an open, ploughed field, with its lines of mounds about 18 inches high, indicating guinea corn or yam cultivation. My intention was to reach a backwater some half a mile away, which I had noticed as we steamed up the river a short time before tying up. I hoped I might find hippo, or, at any rate, an alligator or two hidden in the seclusion of this secret byway of the great river. Crossing the field, I entered a kind of copse consisting of minor trees and scrub. Pushing my way through, I found some clearer ground carpeted with the gourd plant. Ahead of me, I noticed that the land suddenly dipped to a large pool that might have been connected with the main river. This, I thought, would do as well as my backwater, especially as I heard just then the distant grunting roar of a hippo. Next moment, without warning, the solid ground gave way under my feet, and I went hurtling down into black darkness, bringing up with a tremendous shock that seemed to jar me from tip to toe. When I had recovered from my utter astonishment and had made certain that no bones were broken, I looked about and above me to see where I was and what had happened. Around and beneath me, I could see nothing. Everything was shrouded in impenetrable blackness. Above me, however, I saw the evening sky, gradually fading into night. My gun was gone. Where was I? What had happened? Had the earth opened and swallowed me up? I decided to strike a light and see what kind of place I'd fallen into. The blue spurt and the flickering flame, settling almost immediately into a thin, steady tongue of yellow fire, revealed to me the fact that I had fallen into some kind of trap, probably for hippo, and that this trap was some 8 feet long by 5 broad and 10 deep. At the bottom, at regular intervals, were placed pointed stakes about 18 inches apart. Had I fallen prone, I should have been impaled. I had apparently then something to be thankful for. As this thought struck me, my match burnt the tips of my fingers and I dropped it. As it fell, something caught my eye that froze my blood in my veins. Some coiled black thing was slowly moving in the farther corner. Part of its body was shrouded in the shadow of the stakes, but I saw enough to convince me that my companion was some kind of venomous snake. Do you know what it is to feel the heart stop dead still after one fierce bound into the throat, the body go cold and clammy like dank, damp clay, like the earth that I leaned up against in that moment of dumb, stricken terror? You can't imagine what I felt then, 10 feet down in the bowels of the earth, imprisoned with that coiling thing. Pray that you may never experience this, for it seems as though life is passing from oneself in the cold sweat which oozes through every pore. I leant against the side of the pit, trembling like an aspen leaf. Oh, for my gun and a steady light. At least I could then stake all in one try for life. My hands shaking violently, I lit another match and glanced in the direction of the horror. I might have spared my pains. The brute, a long, black, shiny snake with a sort of hooded head, was actually at my feet, the sinuous body stretched across the rough floor among the pointed stakes. I stood still as though paralysed, the match burning like a tiny flare in my uplifted right hand. The snake came straight on without striking, and as the match went out, it started to coil up my left leg. The sensation of that strange, gliding grip which squeezed the muscles as it passed along is impossible to describe. Up it came in the darkness, higher and higher still, feeling like a band of steel round my body, and heavy. Suddenly, to my dying day, I shall never forget the horror of that moment. Its cold, hard snout touched my chin. It was just a sort of gliding touch, with no attempt at striking. Obeying a mad impulse, I gripped straight for where the neck should be, judging by the feel of the snout on my chin, and with the strength of a maniac my fingers closed on the snake just behind the head. Feeling my advantage, I forced my 2 thumbs deep into its throat. Then I tripped forward in my excitement, the coils of the snake suddenly contracting with a fierce pressure as I strengthened my grip. Down I went, tearing myself badly on 2 stakes as I fell, gashing my right leg above the knee, the scar remains to this day, and receiving a nasty bruise on my left shoulder. In spite of my fall, however, I had enough presence of mind to keep the terrible head at arm's length, and now, once on the ground, in spite of cuts, bruises, and the twining coils round my arm, I got onto my knees and banged and dashed that deadly head on the hard earth, and against the stakes I could feel on either side. How long I kept on in my wild, frenzied fury, I don't know, but gradually the fierce gripping coils relaxed, until at last the limp form hung from my bleeding hands, lifeless and harmless. I don't remember what happened then, but I think I lost consciousness for a time. All I know for certain is that I was hauled out of that hole some time later, about 8 p.m. to be exact, by 2 of the coloured deckhands who had tracked me through the field and the bushes, and ultimately to the edge of the hippo trap. They guessed that I had fallen in, and the lowering of a lamp that they carried proved this to be the case. My gun lay where it had fallen, close to the edge. Why that snake never struck me I do not know to this day, unless it was that, seeing me in the sudden light of the match, leaning up against the opposite wall, it had attempted to get out of the pit, into which it also must have dropped by accident like myself, by using my body as a ladder. For all I know, the skeleton of the creature still lies in that 10-foot deep hole. I've not since been there to inquire, nor do I intend to do so in the future. The very thought of the place is nightmare enough. This incident occurred about 4 miles below Abuchi, the trading station near Onitsha, before one comes to the shallows that make that part of the Niger so difficult in the dry season.
Our next story takes us way back to 1907 on a routine assignment with an American sanitary inspector on the Philippine island of Negros, which turns into a fight for life in The Coils of a Boa Constrictor by O.P. Kingsley.
Early in the year 1900, I was stationed in the south of Negros Island in the Philippines at the little barrio of Bayanan. Here, I acted in the capacity of sanitary inspector of the La Carlota sub-district of Negros. The territory included in my district was many miles in extent, but owing to the fact that the greater portion was wild and inhabited only by roving tribes of Visayans, whose haunts lay far in the unexplored interior, my work was confined to the small settlements located within a radius of 40 miles, many of these being extremely difficult of access on account of the dense tropical growth and the unsettled condition of the country. As I sat in my office, one pleasant morning, contentedly smoking a cigar and contemplating with pleasure a short trip I had planned for the afternoon, a sharp rap on the door brought me back abruptly from my reveries. At my invitation, a local boy entered, bearing a letter, which he deposited upon the desk and withdrew. A glance at the address showed me that it was from the chief inspector of the department. The contents, which I rapidly glanced over, directed me to proceed without delay to a little barrio called La Paz, situated some 30 miles inland, to investigate a reported epidemic of smallpox raging in that vicinity among the villagers. Realizing the gravity of the situation, should the report be true, I decided to start at once. I had never visited the place before and was not sure of the exact distance or the difficulties liable to be met with en route. For these reasons, I was desirous of having plenty of daylight to travel by, Hastily collecting the necessary equipment, together with my revolvers and ammunition, I crammed the things into my saddlebags and stepped out just as the horses were brought up. One for myself, the other for my old help, Juan, who was to act as guide and interpreter. Our route for several miles lay along a well-beaten trail, which would have been pleasant enough for ordinary travel, had it not been for the fierce heat of the sun. Soon, however, we reached Rio del Sangre, the bamboos along the banks of which afforded a delicious shade, though the riverbed was practically dry. My guide now informed me that by following the channel we could shorten the distance by several miles, and I therefore turned my horse upstream, glad enough to keep in the shade. As we advanced toward the interior, the scenery became more wild and picturesque, the vegetation rank and luxuriant, the trees meeting in many places and forming a series of leafy tunnels. The only sound to disturb the stillness was the dull thud, thud of our horses' hooves, hardly audible in the soft riverbed, with an occasional shrill cry from a monkey who had discovered us from his leafy bower, or the lazy flutter of a gaily plumed parrot as it changed its position. Advancing in single file, owing to the narrowness of the riverbed and the many obstructions that we constantly encountered in the form of roots and fallen tree trunks, I was soon some distance ahead, and entering a space comparatively clear of obstructions, I spurred my mount into a gallop as the sun was rapidly sinking towards the horizon, and I was anxious to reach my destination before dark. Rounding a sharp bend, my horse, with a wild snort, plunged heavily, wheeling sharply to the right. Being unprepared for such a maneuver, I was hurled headlong from the saddle, landing head and shoulder in the soft, muddy riverbed. My face was smeared with the filthy, ill-smelling muck. My neck felt as though it was broken, my brain was in a dizzy whirl, and my eyes were blinded with the odorous mud. For a moment I did not try to move. Although I was aware of a curious movement beneath me, I supposed I had been thrown upon some roots, which were slowly giving way beneath my weight. Suddenly, my attention was attracted by a strange hissing noise, which sounded quite close to me, and which, in my dazed condition, I was at a loss to account for. Meanwhile, the movement beneath me increased rather than diminished. This was certainly unnatural, and I rolled over with the intention of reaching firmer ground, but found that my right leg was entangled in something. At my first movement, the mysterious hissing increased until it sounded like escaping steam, and the movement beneath me became so violent as to partially raise my body from the riverbed. Dashing the mud from my eyes as best I could, I threw out my hands for some available support. My right grasped mud, but the left caught hold of a cold, slimy, wriggling body. And then the truth of my situation dawned upon me, literally freezing my blood with horror, while the most sickening sensation I have ever experienced passed over me. I lay in the folds of a great boa constrictor. Had I been in the best of physical condition, unarmed, I should have been no match for this great reptile, and situated as I was, practically in a semi-conscious state, I must surely fall an easy victim. The thought of my position made me frenzied. I attempted to regain my feet, but now my left leg was pinioned with my right, and struggle as I would, I could not free them. In frantic rage, I clutched the slimy coils to fling them from me, but only to be dashed down with stunning force. Again and again I tried to wrench myself free, but all in vain. With clenched fists I beat the great body and tried to tear the creature to pieces with my nails, but the thick scales were as proof against my attack as armor plate. Meanwhile, We rolled over and over in the riverbed, as with strength born of desperation. I fought the loathsome monster, which was slowly crushing the life out of me. The thought of my pistol flashed through my mind, and I felt for my holster, but it was empty. I had placed the weapon in my saddlebags. Frantically, I tried to tear from my body the ever-tightening folds, but struggle as I would, it was of no avail. I was fast getting tired. A dizziness seized me, and the trees and shrubs seemed to be tumbling and whirling about in wild confusion. Suddenly, my strength seemed to desert me altogether, and I stopped struggling, while just above my face, swaying now to the right, now to the left, was the snake's head. Like a pendulum of death, whose every stroke was bringing me nearer to destruction. Strange thoughts flitted across my mind. Incidents of boyhood life, long since forgotten, were brought vividly to memory, and I seemed to stand again in the old homestead with my friends about me, though all were strangely silent. As I watched, the scene began to melt away like a mist. A blinding flash, accompanied by a deafening report, the rush of a dark body over me. Then all was darkness. When next I opened my eyes, Juan, my Filipino man, was rapidly unwinding the now lifeless serpent from my body, while on the ground beside me lay a blood-stained dagger and a pistol still smoking. Having freed me from the reptile, Juan brought water and proceeded to remove the worst of the filth from my person. The cold water also served to revive me, but I lay helplessly upon the soft grass while Juan recaptured my horse. This done, Juan assisted me into the saddle and supported me until we reached a settlement, where I remained at the house of a friendly villager until I had recovered somewhat from the effects of my encounter. My nerves, however, remained in a wretched state for many months. My dreams were haunted by great dragons and hydra-headed monsters who chased me over river and jungle. Just as they were on the point of crushing me to death, I would wake up with a wild yell, bathed in cold sweat and trembling in every limb, but by degrees this wore off until I became my natural self. Juan, good fellow that he was, secured and preserved for me the skin of the boa constrictor, which so nearly made an end of me. It measured 14.5 feet in length and 11 inches in circumference. In due season, I had it mounted as a little souvenir of my stay in the Philippine Islands, and it is shown in the accompanying photography, with the revolver and dagger which put an end to it.
Night falls over a remote store in Zululand in 1908, but when a local boy warns of a lurking danger, the shopkeeper finds himself in the dark with the MAMBA by Austin Berry.
Looking at a map of Natal and following the course of the Tugela River from its mouth, you will see a small tributary marked Insuzi River, which has its source in the Nkankla Mountains, Zululand. This river follows a very tortuous course as it rushes to join the Tugela and is fed by numerous streams which dash down the mountainsides in waterfalls and cascades, cutting down through the rocks and forming long spurs with gorgeous, hundreds of feet deep bitpleen. Some years ago, I was running a general store which was situated on the slope of one of the long spurs aforementioned overlooking the Nkuzana stream. At the time of which I am speaking, there were a good many prospectors in the valley, and a syndicate was working claims up the Nkuzana stream. Besides trading with the natives, I did a fairly good business with these plucky pioneers of civilization. Game was pretty plentiful and also snakes. A more salubrious region for these creatures I was never in. I had an instinctive feeling of repugnance for snakes and never passed one without at least trying to kill it. One evening, after telling the umfan, a native lad, to close the store, I was sitting outside my wattle and daub hut, enjoying a smoke, when suddenly the boy came rushing up, shouting, "Boss, boss, inyo ka umkulu kakulu." Boss, a very big snake. Springing to my feet, I asked him where it had gone and what kind of snake it was. He replied that it was too dark to see, but it was very large. He had seen it go into the store just as he was about to close the door. "All right," I said, "go and shut the store up now." But the lad remained where he was, shaking with fright, and it was obvious that he dare not go near the place while that snake remained inside. My other boys had been sent away on errands in the morning and had not yet returned. At first I thought I would leave the snake until the morning, but remembering that I had just received a fresh supply of goods which were lying about the store and would give the creature plenty of hiding places, I thought it better to have it out with the brute there and then, otherwise it would mean turning the store inside out next morning to look for it. From the boy's description I took it to be a young python, able to inflict a severe bite, but not venomous. Selecting a good stick and taking a lighted candle with me, I went to the store, slipped quietly in and closed the door behind me. Placing the candle on the counter, I looked around in the dim light. Hearing a slight noise at the end of the store, I crept towards it and presently saw the head of a snake appear just above a bale of blankets, its body being on the other side. I struck at him, but as he dodged the blow, I saw that it was not a python. Jumping back, I tripped and fell with a crash amongst the tin billies and tribal pots. In falling, I saw a hissing streak of black, which struck at me as it flashed past and made for the door. Any doubts I had as to the kind of snake it was were now dispelled. By the sickly smell of musk, I knew the creature was a black mamba and the largest of its kind I had ever seen. Heartily, I cursed myself for my folly in not bringing my shotgun with me, for now I was fairly trapped, the brute being between me and the door. The black mamba is one of the most dangerous of deadly snakes. Besides the virulence of its venom, it is very ferocious, and when at bay will attack a human being with incredible fury. The extraordinary quickness of its movements makes it still more to be dreaded. It will dodge a blow from a stick and strike back before its opponent has time to recover. And here was I, shut up, through my own stupidity, with a serpent of this description, which appeared to me to be about 12 feet in length. Meanwhile, the brute, finding its retreat cut off, turned towards me again. I could see its evil-looking eyes scintillating in the dim light of the candle. I hurled some weights at it, in the hope of injuring it enough to stop it from springing, but this only had the effect of still further incensing the mamba, and it gathered itself together to attack me. Promptly, I jumped up to get on the other side of the counter. In my hurry, keeping my eyes all the time on the snake, I upset the candle and sent it flying, leaving myself in total darkness. My feelings at that moment were not exactly enviable. Searching hastily in my pocket for a match, I found, to my dismay, that I must have left them by the chair where I had been smoking outside, and the stock of matches in the store was at the other end, with the snake barring the road. Just then I heard the mamba, with a loud hiss, hit the thin wood lining in front of the counter as it struck out in my direction. Thinking that it was trying to get at me over the counter, I lashed out wildly to right and left with my stick. But beyond clearing the counter and bringing a shower of articles from the shelves about me, I did no harm to the snake except to rouse it to still greater fury. I could hear the brute striking continually, anywhere and everywhere, it seemed to me. The thud of its blows sounding loud against the wood lining. Standing helplessly in the darkness, with death in hideous shape coming nearer and nearer, I realized to the full the horror of my position. To say I was in a blue funk is no exaggeration. I felt cold, my skin seemed to creep, and if my hair did not actually stand on end, I experienced all the sensations of its doing so. I continued slashing wildly, however, expecting every moment to feel a blow and the deadly fangs buried in my flesh. But the strain was getting too much for my nerves. I felt like screaming when I heard the little door between the counter and front of the store fly back with a thud. The snake, striking furiously all along the front of the counter, had at last come to the door. Not being bolted, the force of the blow had sent it crashing back. The noise of that opening door brought me to my senses, for I knew now where my enemy was. Thinking the snake was coming round to the back of the counter, I immediately jumped on top, my head coming into violent contact with boots and other articles hanging from the ceiling. Wrenching them from the hooks, I threw them in the direction where I thought the snake was, and then took a flying leap towards the door. Next instant, I gave a terrified yell, for I came down right on top of the MAMBA, feeling the snake's body give and turn under my foot. I was now fairly demoralized and almost mad with terror. Wrenching open the door, I leapt out and slammed it hard behind me, well nigh fainting when I got out into the cool evening air. Making for my hut, I got some whiskey and took a good stiff drink, which brought me round. Next morning, with a couple of cartridges in my shotgun, I went to the store and, opening the door softly, beheld the cause of my fright lying coiled up peacefully on some sacks. I raised the weapon, pulled the trigger, and the charge of number 5 did its work. I told the boys to bring the snake outside, and getting a ruler, measured the MAMBA, finding him to be 10 feet 9 inches in length, the finest I have ever seen. On examining the woodwork of the counter, we could see the marks of the fangs where the brute had struck again and again in his blind fury.
Phew, that was one scary MAMBA story. Now, let's venture further into the African veldt, where a hunter's encounter with a guinea fowl takes a deadly turn when he finds himself ensnared by the crushing coils of a python. Alone and far from help, he faces the chilling reality that this battle might be his last in Man vs. Python by Victor Pitt-Kethley.
On April 27, 1907, Mr. W. J. Coughlin of Sequani via Machudi, South Africa, accompanied a party of friends on a shooting expedition in the neighbourhood of Sequani. Upon arriving at the point selected, some 5 miles distant from the township, the party separated. For some little time Mr. Coughlin pursued his way without incident. Then he suddenly espied a guinea fowl, which he brought down with a well-aimed shot. Rushing across the veldt to retrieve his prize, he began descending a small dip in the ground when, to his shock and horror, he realised he was nearly face to face with a large python, coiled tightly in front of him. Catching sight of the startled sportsman, the great snake moved. Its tail caught Mr. Coughlin between the legs, tripping him up, and before he could save himself, he was flung headlong into the deadly, irresistible coils, which immediately closed around his body in a vice-like grip. Desperately, the hunter tried to extricate himself, but all in vain. The python had him fast in such a way that his left arm, holding his gun, was pinned to his side. With the cold sweat breaking out upon his flesh, Coughlin threw himself this way and that in a frenzy of desperation, for he realised only too well the horrible nature of the death trap into which he had walked. He shouted for help, hoping to make his friends hear and bring them to his rescue, but no answer came to his calls. No human being appeared in sight. And all the time man and snake lay there on the sunny veldt, the reptile's mighty coils growing always a little tighter as it tried to lessen its victim's struggles. Presently, Finding the pressure upon his body becoming unendurable, Mr. Coughlin gripped the snake by the throat, striving wildly to free himself. Over and over, this way and that, the pair rolled, the python seeking all the time to free its hideous head or tighten its coils sufficiently to put an end to Coughlin's struggles. For around 10 to 15 minutes, minutes that seemed like hours of torture, this unequal, terrifying fight went on, and still neither had gained any decided advantage. The man still lived, though fast in the coils of the snake, which in turn, though it held its captive securely, was unable to crush him outright or to release his hold upon its throat, which prevented it throwing a coil round his neck and strangling him. Now, a python is so constructed that it can exert its crushing powers to the full only when it is able to get a leverage upon some fixed object, say, by taking a turn with its tail around a tree. Apparently realizing that something of this kind was required to enable it to finish off its prisoner, the great snake altered its tactics and started to drag Mr. Coughlin over the ground towards a large hardwood tree which stood some distance away. The man saw and understood. The battle was about to enter its last and most dreadful phase. Desperately he fought against the snake, trying to get at his knife, which was in his right-hand coat pocket, with the idea of cutting the creature's throat. But to his horror he found that the reptile's coils passed over the place where the weapon lay. "Finding I could not get my knife," said Mr. Coughlin, in a letter which he wrote to the Cape Times subsequently, and thinking that my chances of surviving were not very bright, I determined I would not die alone. I saw that the barrel of my gun projected just about an inch through between my arm and body, where the arm was pinned to the side, and luckily I managed to reach the trigger with my left hand. Gripping the python firmly by the throat and holding its head well away, I pulled the trigger. The bullet, fortunately for me, caught the snake through the back. It then relaxed its grip and I got rid of its coils as fast as I could. When I got upon my feet, I put my gun down and looked for a big stone to finish the brute with. Not finding one, I was about to put my foot on its head and cut its throat when the snake made another attack upon me, getting hold of my coat sleeve and again pulling me to the ground. Once more it attempted to get its coils round me, but I escaped them. It still retained its bite on my sleeve, however. I managed to get my foot on its throat, which made it open its mouth. Then I got my arm free and called for my friends again. One of them heard me and came running up. He saw that there had been a struggle and shot the python through the head, thus putting the finishing touch to what was for me the closest call I've ever had.
Happy to know you survived that encounter, Mr. Coughlin. Now we turn our attention to a veteran snake collector who finds himself in a high-stakes game of patience with one of the deadliest snakes of Venezuela, the fer-de-lance. In a dark, rain-soaked hut, the hunter-collector, alongside two nervous Indians, wait in the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of the escaped serpent before it catches them. But when the snake reappears, it's not just patience that will be tested, it's survival as they face a situation that is Touch and Go, written by G.R. O'Reilly.
My adventure took place in 1890 in eastern Venezuela, where the mountains between the great river Orinoco and the southern shores of the Caribbean look out upon the Gulf of Paria. I had gone over from Trinidad to obtain for my collection one or two living specimens of the South American rattlesnake, or Crotalus dorissus, which, although common in Venezuela, is not found in Trinidad, in spite of the fact that at 2 points the island is almost within stone's throw of the mainland. Shortly after reaching Venezuela, I fell in with two rugged South American Indians who were engaged in searching the forests for valuable orchids for a wealth planter. In their work, they often met with snakes, and in seeking for snakes, I used to see the orchids, so that it suited both parties to hunt together, and a very adventurous time it proved to be. They were brothers, copper-colored, straight-haired, sad-faced, squat of figure, tough as peccaries, and agile as monkeys, but silent and watchful as wild cats. The name of one, appropriately enough, was Saturnino, while his brother was called Cipriano. For some time we camped together in a palm-thatched hut on the hillside, and while staying there, It happened one day that Saturnino and I went out alone into the forest, leaving Cipriano at the hut. Rather late in the evening, we were lucky enough to capture alive a full-grown specimen of the Venezuelan coima de agua, or fer-de-lance, or Bothrops atrox in Latin, one of the most deadly of all venomous snakes. During the adventure, we got a ducking in the river and went home with our prize tied up in a bag, feeling anything but comfortable in our water-soaked clothing. Night had already fallen in the tropical forest when Saturnino and I reached the palm-thatched hut, but Cipriano had a big fire blazing outside, and the lamp was shining within, so that everything looked quite cozy and snug. As we were both wet to the skin from our soaking in the river, we dried our clothing and enjoyed the warmth. That night, after supper, we reclined in our hammocks, smoking and talking, till the lamp burned out. Later on, the rain came down in torrents and extinguished the very last sparks of the smoldering fire, so that finally we lay there in absolute darkness. Now, darkness is favorable to rats, of which we had some at the hut, attracted there probably by the frequent odor of baked armadillo. As they never obtained very much armadillo, they made themselves free with our other provisions. And, like most wild creatures, once they had tasted the difference, they preferred cooked food to raw. I had lain silent for a long time in the darkness, as I thought the two Indians were sleeping. All was still in the hut, except for a rat gnawing in one corner. Before supper, I had thrown the bag containing the fer-de-lance down on the floor.
I had heard a rat nibbling for quite a considerable time. Suddenly, the nibbling ceased.
Then there was silence again, till Saturnino called out to me.
"A snake has bitten a rat. Get up and look at your snake. I believe he is out of the bag."
A moment's reflection made me think that the Indian had probably hit on the truth. I struck a match. The very last match we possessed, by the way. I didn't dare to put my feet out of the hammock, lest I should step on the snake. But the light was enough to show me a fer-de-lance coiled on top of the bag in the corner, and a rat lying dead on the floor within a foot of him. Then the burnt-out match fell on the floor. The two Indians saw the coiled snake and the dead rat as well as I did.
"Stay in the hammock,"
they cried.
"Strike another match and light the lamp."
"Ah," said I, "there are no more matches,"
"Never mind,"
returned the resourceful Cipriano.
"Stay where you are in the hammock. I'll get the fire sticks."
Then I heard him rustling in the thatch of the wall at the head of his hammock, and then through the darkness, the sound of the twirling upright stick between his palms came to my ears. So I knew he would soon have a kindling. It ought not to have taken more than a minute and a half or 2 minutes to get the spark from the fire sticks, but on this occasion it took fully 5, because the sticks were very damp, due to the air being laden with vapor from the combined effects of the heat and the rain. At last, however, the friction overcame the dampness, and the noise of the revolving fire stick ceased. Cipriano had a spark on the point of it. Raising it gently to the point of his mouth, he blew upon it, and in an instant the whole top of the stick became a fiery pencil of glowing charcoal. Placing this in a tinder of rubbed-up leaves, and blowing upon that, he soon had a little blaze, by the light of which we replenished our lamp and relighted it. The dead rat was gone, and so was the snake. He had probably swallowed the rat. Without leaving the hammock, I moved the lamp about so as to look all over the floor, but no trace of the snake could we see. So we all got up to look for him, for none of us could think of sleeping in the hut with such a terribly venomous creature at large. If we could only have been certain that he had gone off to the woods, we should have felt contented enough. But for my part, I didn't believe that he had. For where a snake gets one rat, he always wants to look for another. First of all, I went to the bag, to see if it were really my insact captive that had escaped. Yes, there was a hole in a corner of the bag. I picked it up and shook it, whereupon some of the roast parrot-flavored boiled beans, which Saturnino had carried in it, dropped out upon the floor. That made plain the cause of the snake's escape. The unfortunate rat had scented the pleasing odor of the cooked beans that had stuck in the corner of the bag and had gnawed a hole through to get in at them. He evidently hauled them out with his paws and was sitting up on his haunches to eat them when the fer-de-lance, coming forth through the newly made hole, struck the nibbling rodent dead on the spot. All over the hut we searched most diligently, but no trace of the escaped snake could we discover. With great care we lifted every object he could possibly hide under, but he was certainly not in the hut, so we got into our hammocks again, although we didn't feel like sleeping. I told the Indians that if we laid quite still, the snake would most probably after a while come back to the very same spot where he had swallowed the rat. So we left the lamp burning and lay motionless in our hammocks. Now anyone who has ever strained his eyes in watching, especially at night time, by the poor light of a makeshift lamp, really no better than a candle, can easily understand that one of us would presently imagine that he saw something. Before long, therefore, Saturnino thought he saw the snake. This, however, was not enough for me. I would not stir from the hammock till I got a sure and undoubted sight of him. And even then I meant to lie still until the reptile came into such a position as would favor me in recapturing him. I told this to the Indians, and warned them to lie absolutely motionless. Now, to lie absolutely still for a time on the broad of one's back is strongly conducive to sleepiness. So it proved with us, and all three of us must have dozed off together, but it was only an involuntary nap, and we were quickly awakened by a rustling in the thatch of the wall. "There it is again," said I. "The thatch unmistakably rustles,"
Yes, yes, I saw it stirring.
said Cipriano.
The wall thatch undoubtedly moved down there by the floor, in that very same corner where the snake bag was lying.
Then, out from between the bottom thatch and the floor, came the triangular head of the snake.
"Don't move a muscle,"
said I to the Indians. "If you make the least movement, he'll go back, and we may never see him again." If 3 dead men had been lying in that hut, they couldn't have stayed more perfectly still than we did, as we anxiously watched for the next 15 or 20 minutes. The cat-eyed reptile, seeing everything quiet, soon began to come farther and farther out. Its velvet-textured scales, of an obscure drab earth color, irregularly marked with darker crossbands, rendered it so inconspicuous upon that floor of dun-colored clay that, if our eyes had not been guided to the spot by the noise of its movements in the palm leaf thatch, I do not believe we should ever have noticed it. On all its upper surface there was not a single scale reflecting the light. So perfectly has nature clothed this deadly viper in a coat that will render it almost invisible to its intended prey. Of course, I knew that it was not after us that the snake was coming out from its hiding place in the palm thatch wall. It was only following the traces of the rat. I told the Indians so, but they would hardly credit it. I impressed upon them that, although they must lie still so as not to alarm it, they can speak as freely as they wished, as the snake could not hear our voices, for the simple reason that all snakes are absolutely deaf. They would not believe this for an instant. They were convinced, they said, that it was coming to kill us. Nevertheless, I insisted that they wait a little longer and observe its actions. Inch by inch it emerged, till its whole length was visible. With head bent to the ground, it went back and forth over the place where the unfortunate rat had been slain and devoured. I knew that it was busily examining the trail of the rat with the sensitive and probing points of its tongue, forked into 2 tips of thread-like fineness and delicacy. For several minutes we watched it gloating, as it were, over the old traces of its victim. When the Indians, seeing all this, admitted that I knew the ways of snakes better than they did, I very gently took my long snake stick in my hands, and telling Saturnino to be ready to stand behind me with our lamp, I jumped suddenly from the hammock, and, before the startled snake had time to glide away, I pressed the bent end of the stick across its neck, holding it firmly against the floor. The frightened reptile, on finding itself thus tightly held, lashed its tail and body about wildly in efforts to escape. I shouted excitedly to Saturnino to hurry up behind me with the lamp, so that I could see to grip the creature safely behind the head. But at this very moment, a most unexpected accident intervened. Right over and about a foot above my head was a thick pole, put across from eave to give stability within the hut. Upon this pole, and tethered to it by a long strip of raw tapir hide, a pet monkey of Saturnino's was sleeping. My loud call for the lamp had 2 effects. It made Saturnino run up close behind me with it, And it also suddenly woke up the monkey, who, seeing the snake, jumped down with a cry of terror onto his master's neck. This sudden advent of the monkey on one side of him, at such a time, made the already nervous Saturnino fall towards the other side, striking against the end of my snake stick, protruding behind me, and causing me to lose my hold on the snake's neck. Nor was this the worst of it, for the lamp which Saturnino let fall was extinguished. And there we were, in total darkness, afraid to stir either hand or foot, lest we should meet with death by running foul of the escaped viper. Instinctively we both stood still. During all this time, Cipriano, very luckily, had never moved from his hammock, and now he quickly found his fire sticks, got them going again, and soon had a little blaze in the tinder, giving light sufficient for me to see, much to my relief, that the snake was nowhere near me. I relighted the lamp and searched all around the hut, but the reptile had gone completely out of sight. Saturnino, as soon as he had the monkey pacified and put back upon its perch, helped me in the search. We even poked sticks into the palm leaf walls, but no sign of the hidden fer-de-lance could we find anywhere. All three of us concluded, therefore, that having been held down forcibly by the neck with a stick, it had become so effectually scared that it had gone off to the woods for good and all. Very badly indeed did we deceive ourselves in forming such a hasty opinion. When the first signs of day began to appear in the forest, we all agreed that we longed for our coffee, for the wakeful night, so full of exciting events, had induced a most ravenous hunger. Cipriano said he would kindle the fire if his brother would go for the water. But Saturnino found, to his dismay, that the large water gourd was broken. He fell on it when the monkey had jumped on him for refuge. Now, near the door, there lay on its side a large earthenware water jar, of the kind called a tinaja. I myself had brought it with me from the coast. The stopper had fallen out of it and was lying on the floor close by. "Why, here you are, Saturnino," said I, picking up the stopper and putting it into the jar. "This big earthenware thing will hold more than your gourd. I'll go with you to help fetch it back." So Saturnino swung the great jar upon his shoulder, and we both went forth through the dripping forest towards the river. Presently we arrived at the water's edge, where the stream made a nice little bay. It was very deep there, and there was a swift current besides. A great tree had fallen close along by the brink, and out upon this tree Saturnino walked to fill the jar. I went behind him, standing just at his side. He took out the stopper, laid it beside him, and then lowered the jar into the river to let in a little water with which to rinse it out. Presently the water began pouring into it, and at the very same instant that the water went in, out popped the head and neck of the lost fer-de-lance. With a loud "Carajo!" the terrified Saturnino let go his hold. As the jar sank beneath the surface, the snake came to the top and, with only his head protruding, swam off to the southern side. We watched him in silence till he climbed up the bank and disappeared in a thicket of dwarf palm. It would have been impossible to follow him, for these palms grow with their porcupine stalks, so closely together that nothing so large as a man or a hound could ever with safety pass through them. By that time, however, I was really glad to see the last of the snake. Oh well, we had had too many touch-and-go experiences with him to make his company desirable, so we just let it go. Better luck next time, I guess.
And so, these slithering tales come to a close, leaving us with a sense of the primal struggle between man and nature. Each tale reveals that the true terror lies not just in the serpent's fangs or coils, but in the darkness, uncertainty, and the vulnerability that such encounters lay bare. From the lone pits of Africa to the shadowy forests of the Philippines, these men faced the ultimate test of survival, alone with their wits and will. They remind us that sometimes victory isn't about conquering nature, but about living to see another dawn. Until next time, stay vigilant, for in the wild, The unseen might just be coiling at your feet, waiting for its moment in. Bug-eyed tale.